Everyone at Ashford Hall remembered what the Duke did that Christmas Eve, but no one ever thought to ask why she was smiling when she walked out the door. The candles had already been lit when Rosalind descended the stairs. Ashford Hall was magnificent in December. Garlands of holly threaded through the banisters, fires roaring in every hearth, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting up from the kitchens below. For 15 years, this house had been the only home she had ever truly known. She had grown up in its corridors, learned to read in its library, buried her grief in its gardens after her father passed. She knew every creak of its floorboards, every draft in its east wing, every mood of its skies. She had dressed carefully that evening. Her gown was deep green, not fashionable but well-made, the color bringing out the warmth in her dark eyes. She had pinned her hair herself, no maid to assist her, but she had done it neatly and with care. She was not vain about her appearance, but she was not careless either. Tonight was Christmas Eve. Even she had allowed herself that much. The drawing room was already full when she entered. Lord and Lady Pemberton stood near the fire with their 2 daughters. Sir Edmund Graves had arrived from Wiltshire with his eldest son. There were distant cousins, a handful of neighbors, the usual assemblage of Ashford society that gathered each year for the Duke's Christmas dinner. They turned when she entered, and there were nods, a few polite smiles. She was known to all of them, the Duke's ward, raised under his roof, the daughter of his late father's trusted friend. Not family, precisely, but something close to it, or so she had always believed. The Duke stood near the window with Sir Edmund, his back half turned to the room. He did not look up when she entered. She told herself it meant nothing. He was in conversation. He was the host. He had a great many people to attend to. She told herself these things very deliberately, the way one recites a lesson one is not entirely sure of. Dinner was announced at 8. The dining room at Ashford Hall seated 40 when fully extended, though tonight it held only 22. The long table gleamed with silver and crystal, candelabras throwing warm light across the faces of the assembled guests. At the far end, closest to the kitchens, a secondary table had been arranged smaller, plainer, for the senior household staff who dined with the family on Christmas Eve by long tradition. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, Mr. Beale, the butler, the head cook, Mrs. Price, 2 senior footmen. Rosalind moved toward her usual place. She had sat at the Duke's table every Christmas for 15 years, always in the same chair, third from his right, when she heard his mother's voice behind her. Miss Hartwell, the Dowager Duchess's tone was pleasant, clipped, precise. You are there this evening, she turned. The Dowager was gesturing not toward the main table, toward the secondary one, toward the small card bearing her name, written in the Dowager's own careful hand, placed between the chair of Mrs. Price, the cook, and the first footman. The room had gone very quiet. Not silent, people were still speaking, glasses still clinking, chairs still scraping against the parquet floor. But the conversations nearest her had softened, the way they do when something has happened that no one is yet willing to acknowledge. Rosalind looked at the card. She looked at the table. She looked for just a moment at the Duke. He was watching her now. His expression was unreadable, not cold, not apologetic, not anything she could name. He held his wine glass loosely in one hand, and he simply looked at her and said nothing. She turned back to her card. Of course, she said. Her voice came out steady. Later, she would not entirely understand how. She sat down. She unfolded her napkin. Mrs. Price, to her left, gave her a look of such naked horror that Rosalind almost wanted to comfort her. Mr. Beale, to her right, stared rigidly ahead, his jaw tight with something that looked very much like shame on her behalf. Rosalind picked up her soup spoon. She ate the first course in its entirety. She answered when spoken to. She did not cry. She did not flush. She did not look at the Duke's table where the Dowager was holding court, where Lady Pemberton was shooting careful glances toward the secondary table, where the Duke sat with his wine untouched and his eyes fixed somewhere above the centerpiece. She ate every last spoonful of her soup. And then she waited. 3 weeks earlier, she had not meant to read it. That was the thing she kept returning to in the quiet hours before sleep, the pure, almost comic accident of it. She had gone to the Duke's study to return a book she had borrowed from his shelves, a volume of natural history she had finished and meant to replace before he noticed it missing. The study had been empty, the fire burned low, the afternoon light coming thin and gray through the tall windows. She had crossed to the shelves, slid the book back into its place, and turned to leave. The letter had been sitting open on the desk. She had not sought it out, she had not lingered. She had simply turned, and it was there, and the first line had caught her eye before she could stop herself, the way a sudden sound catches the ear before the mind decides whether to listen. The handwriting was the dowager's. Rosalind knew it as well as her own. She has no one to advocate for her. That simplifies things considerably. Rosalind had stood very still for a long moment. Then she had walked out of the study, closed the door behind her, gone up to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed for the better part of an hour. She has no one to advocate for her. She had turned the line over in her mind the way one probes a loose tooth, not to cause pain precisely, but to understand the full extent of the damage. And what struck her, sitting there in the thin afternoon light, was not the cruelty of it. Cruelty she had long since learned to recognize and absorb. What struck her was the efficiency, the matter-of-factness, the way the dowager had written of her as one writes of a piece of furniture that no longer suits the room, not with malice, simply with certainty. And the Duke had not objected. There was no reply on the desk. There was no letter drafted in his hand, no note pushed back across the paper. Only silence, which in its own way was the most complete answer of all. What the dowager did not know, what no one at Ashford Hall knew, was that Rosalind had already written to Edinburgh herself. Not to Mr. Calloway, the solicitor, not to accept the placement arranged for her like a parcel to be dispatched. She had written directly to a Mrs. Agnes Farrow, the widow of a Scottish merchant, who had placed a discreet advertisement in a periodical Rosalind read every month by habit. Mrs. Farrow required a governess for her 3 daughters, beginning the 1st of January. The position offered a private room, a modest but honest wage, and most importantly, a household entirely unconnected to anyone in the dowager's considerable acquaintance. Mrs. Farrow had replied within the week. The position was hers if she wanted it. Rosalind had written back the same afternoon. Yes, she would arrive on the 2nd of January. She had booked her seat on the Edinburgh coach 2 days before Christmas Eve. Her trunk was already packed, tucked behind the armoire in her room, containing everything that was genuinely hers, her books, her mother's brooch, 2 dresses she had bought with her own small allowance, a journal she had kept since girlhood. Everything else in her room, the furniture, the curtains, the writing desk, the view of the south garden, belonged to Ashford Hall. She had looked at all of it carefully, the night before, making sure she was leaving nothing behind that she would grieve. There was, she had decided, very little. So when the dowager had pointed to the card between the cook and the footman, Rosalind had already known 2 things with complete certainty. The first was that she was leaving this house in 8 days, and nothing that happened between now and then could alter it. The second was that she had, for a very long time, been in love with a man who had read that letter and chosen silence. She understood now that the soup course would not be the hardest part of the evening. The hardest part would be sitting within 20 feet of him and feeling none of it show on her face. That had always been her particular talent and her particular burden, the ability to sit very still while something inside her broke quietly, making no sound at all that anyone else could hear. She picked up her spoon again. The second course arrived. The second course was pheasant. The third was a dressed salmon with capers, which Mrs. Price had clearly labored over, and which the guests at the main table consumed with the mild, distracted appreciation of people who expected such things as a matter of course. At the secondary table, Mrs. Price watched her own creation being eaten by others with the professional resignation of a woman who had long since made her peace with such ironies. Mr. Beale refilled the wine with mechanical precision. The two footmen ate in near silence, their eyes trained carefully forward. Rosalind ate the salmon and found it excellent. She said so to Mrs. Price, quietly, and the cook looked at her with an expression that came dangerously close to sentiment before she collected herself, and said only that the capers had come late from the market, and she had been worried. The main table had grown louder as the wine progressed. Lord Pemberton was telling a story about a horse. The distant cousins had found common ground over some grievance involving an entailed property in Dorset. Laughter rose and fell in easy, well-fed waves. Rosalind did not look at the Duke. She was deliberate about this, careful the way one is careful near a flame, not because the flame is unfamiliar, but because she knew precisely how it burned and had decided, finally, to stop reaching for it. It was during the remove, somewhere between the salmon and the arrival of the roasted birds, that she heard the footman beside her suppress a small sound, not quite a laugh, something quieter, and she turned without thinking. He was young, this footman. James, she thought his name was, though she was not entirely certain. He had knocked over a small dish of sauce and was looking at it with such private mortification that, before she could stop herself, she murmured that it happened to the best of them and passed him her own clean napkin under the edge of the table. He looked at her with startled gratitude. She said something else. She couldn't afterward remember what, and he smiled, a quick, relieved, genuine smile, and for just a moment the small secondary table felt almost human. She did not notice, because she was not looking, that the Duke had turned in his chair. He had been watching the room in the unfocused way of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere, and then something had snagged his attention, a movement at the far end, a shift in the light, something. And he had looked down the length of the room to the secondary table, and he had seen her laughing. Not performing composure, not enduring, laughing, quietly, genuinely, at something so small it would have been invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Something moved in his chest that he did not have a name for. He set down his fork. He had the sudden, irrational impulse to rise from his chair, to cross the room, he didn't know, to say something, to undo something. The feeling was specific and urgent and entirely without a clear object, which was the most unnerving kind. He began to push back his chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," his mother's voice cut clean across the room. The dowager had risen from her seat, one hand resting on the table, a glass of champagne already in the other. Her timing, as always, was immaculate. The room quieted with the instant obedience of people long practiced in the art of attending to her. "On this Christmas Eve," the dowager said, her voice carrying the warm, ceremonial pleasure of a woman about to do exactly what she intended, "it is my very great happiness to share with our dear friends an announcement long anticipated by this family." A murmur of delighted anticipation moved through the main table. Lady Pemberton pressed her hands together. The cousins leaned forward. "My son, Edward Ashford, the 6th Duke of Ashford, is to be married." The dowager raised her glass. "To Lady Helena Fitzwilliam, daughter of the Earl of Waverley, whose family has been known to ours these 30 years. We are most fortunate and most glad." The room erupted. Chairs scraped, glasses were raised, voices tumbled over one another with the competitive warmth of people who would all later claim to have known it was coming. Lady Pemberton said she was absolutely delighted. Lord Pemberton said hear, hear, and drank deeply. Even the cousins, whose investment in the matter was negligible, applauded with apparent sincerity. The Duke sat very still. His eyes had gone to Rosalind the moment his mother began speaking, a reflex he could not have explained and did not try to, and they stayed there through the toast, through the applause, through the rising wave of congratulation that swept around the table toward him. Her chair was empty. Her napkin had been folded in precise thirds and laid across her untouched dessert plate. Her wine glass was still half full. Her place card, The one his mother had written sat beside it, perfectly straight, as though placed there with deliberate care. She was gone. He had not seen her leave. He had been looking directly at her, and somehow, in the noise, in the moment his mother's voice had cut across the room, she had simply ceased to be there, as quietly and completely as a candle going out. Someone was shaking his hand. He shook it. Someone else said something, and he replied. His face did what faces do in such moments. It arranged itself into the appropriate expression, said the appropriate words, accepted the appropriate congratulations with the appropriate grace. He did not hear a word of it. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the house had grown quiet, he went to his study. He did not entirely know why. He told himself he had papers to review, correspondence to attend to, the ordinary lies one tells oneself when moving towards something one is not ready to name. The fire had burned to embers. The room was cold and dim. On the corner of his desk, placed with the same precise care as the folded napkin upstairs, sat a small oval frame. He crossed to it and picked it up. It was the miniature he had painted of her when they were 17 and 19 respectively, during a summer that had seemed at the time entirely ordinary and which he now understood, holding this small painting in the half-dark, had not been ordinary at all. There was no note, no explanation, no reproach. Only this returned to him as cleanly and completely as if she were settling an old account. He stood there for a long time, holding it. Outside, the first snow of Christmas began to fall on the empty drive. He expected a letter. That was the first thing, the assumption so natural he barely recognized it as an assumption. People who left always wrote. They explained themselves, justified themselves, asked for things, accused someone of something. There was always a letter, a note, some trace of the departure that allowed the one left behind to feel that the matter was not entirely finished, that there was still a thread to pull, a conversation to be had, a resolution waiting somewhere just ahead. Nothing came. The day after Christmas, he told himself she had needed time. The day after that, he found himself listening for her step in the corridor above his study, a habit so old and so involuntary that he didn't notice he was doing it until the silence where the sound should have been became its own kind of presence. On the 28th, he asked Mrs. Hartley, as casually as he could manage, whether she had heard from Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Hartley looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Edinburgh, Your Grace," she said. "She left on the 27th, the morning coach." He stood in the doorway of the linen room where he had found her, and he said nothing for a moment that went on slightly too long. "I see," he said finally. "She left everything in good order," Mrs. Hartley added, in the tone of someone who has decided to be scrupulously factual in lieu of saying what she actually thought. "Her room was immaculate. She took very little." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley." He went back to his study and sat behind his desk and looked at the miniature, which he had not returned to its drawer, and thought about Edinburgh, a city he had visited once, briefly, in a wet November 11 years ago, which had left him with no particular impression except that it was very far from Wiltshire. He wrote 3 letters over the following week. The first was careful and formal, the kind of letter a guardian writes to a ward who has left without proper notice, expressing concern for her welfare and requesting confirmation of her safe arrival and current address. He read it back and found it so bloodless that he was ashamed of it. He sent it anyway, because he did not know how to write the other kind. The second letter he wrote at midnight on New Year's Eve, with the house quiet around him and the fire lower than it should have been, and a glass of brandy he had not much wanted sitting at his elbow. That letter said rather more than the first. He was not entirely sure, reading it back in the sober light of the following morning, whether it said too much or still not enough. He sealed it before he could reconsider and gave it to the post. The third he wrote in January after 10 days of silence from Edinburgh. It was shorter than the others. He had spent a long time on it and arrived, finally, at 3 sentences that he felt were honest without being entirely without dignity. He sent it by express. None of them were answered. Not refused, not returned, not replied to with coldness or anger or even the formal 2 lines of acknowledgement that basic courtesy would have required. Simply not answered, as though they had been received, read, set aside, and quietly determined to be beside the point. He found this somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger he understood. Anger gave you something to push against. This was different. This felt like arriving at a door you had always walked through freely and finding it simply no longer there. Lady Helena Fitzwilliam came to Ashford Hall in the 2nd week of January, accompanied by her mother and a formidable quantity of luggage, for what was described as a getting acquainted visit. She was handsome, composed, and perfectly agreeable. She admired the portrait gallery with what appeared to be genuine interest. She sat through dinner with his mother and a selection of neighbors without any visible signs of distress. She was everything, in short, that the situation required, and the Duke was aware, watching her across the table on the first evening, that he felt for her precisely nothing, not dislike, not attraction, not curiosity. Only a mild, dispassionate appreciation of her obvious competence, of the kind one might feel toward a well-organized household account. She caught him distracted on the 2nd evening and said, with a directness he had not expected, "You are thinking about someone else." It was not a question. He looked at her. She looked back with the calm, slightly weary expression of a woman who had been through enough drawing-room performances to recognize one when she saw it. "I am sorry," he said, because it was true and because she deserved that much. "Don't be," she said. "I am in much the same position as it happens." She picked up her wine glass. "We have both been managed into this very elegantly, haven't we?" He said nothing. She drank her wine. "I would like," she said presently, "to discuss this with you properly before the week is out. There may be a solution that suits us both rather better than the one our families have arranged." He nodded slowly. It was, he thought, the most honest conversation he had had in several months. His mother came to find him on a gray Tuesday morning in late January. She wished to discuss the wedding arrangements, the date, the church, the guest list, the particular political significance of inviting or not inviting certain families from the northern counties. She sat across from him at his desk with her small leather notebook open in her lap and her pen ready, and her expression carrying the pleasant, purposeful energy of a woman engaged in work she considers important. The Duke listened for some time. Then he said, very quietly, "What did you write to Calloway about Rosalind?" A pause, very brief, so brief that if he had not been watching for it, he would have missed it entirely. "I don't know what you mean," his mother said. "I think you do." She held his gaze for a moment with the assurance of a woman who had held far more difficult gazes than this one. Then she said, with a small composed adjustment of her posture, "I did what was necessary. You were not going to do it yourself. You had no authority." "I had every authority." Her voice did not rise, it never rose. She was a fixture in this household that had outlasted its appropriate season. You know this. You simply lacked the will to address it, and the situation was becoming remarked upon. I acted on your behalf as I have always done. "On my behalf," he repeated. "Yes." She read that letter, another pause, longer this time. "Then she will have understood the position clearly," his mother said, "which is perhaps just as well." He stood up from his desk. It was a simple movement. He simply rose from his chair, but something in it made his mother, for the first time in the conversation, go quite still. "She sat at that table," he said, "at Christmas, below the kitchen staff, because you put her there, and she had already read in your own handwriting that she had no one to advocate for her, and she sat there and ate her soup and said nothing and left without a word, and He stopped. The sentence had somewhere it needed to go, and he was not yet sure he was prepared to arrive there. I did nothing. Edward. I sat 20 feet away, and I did nothing. The study was very quiet. Outside, the January wind moved through the elms with a low, persistent sound like something trying to get in. His mother looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite irritation, but something composed of both. In the proportions of a woman who has been right about most things for a very long time and has not yet fully accepted that this might be one of the exceptions. "She is gone," she said finally, "and you have obligations that do not bend themselves to sentiment. I suggest you remember that." She closed her notebook, rose from her chair, and left him. He stood behind his desk for a long time after the door closed, looking at the miniature on the corner where he had left it, and understanding, with the particular quality of understanding that arrives too late and sits too heavily, exactly what he had allowed to happen in that dining room on Christmas Eve. She had known, she had sat there knowing, and still she had folded her napkin in precise thirds and left without asking him for a single thing. That, more than any of it, was what he could not stop turning over. She had expected nothing from him, and he had given her exactly that. The coach journey to Edinburgh took 2 days and 1 night, with a stop in a market town in the Midlands where the inn was cold, and the mattress suspicious, and the other passengers. A wool merchant, his wife, and a clergyman who sneezed with operatic frequency, offered the kind of company that required no actual conversation, only the occasional nod of shared endurance. Rosalind had brought 4 books and read none of them. She sat with one open in her lap for most of the first day and looked out the window instead, watching England unfold itself in its winter colors, the bare hedgerows, the frosted fields, the villages passing like pages of a book she had already finished. She had made this decision. She was at peace with it. She kept telling herself these things with the steady, slightly effortful conviction of someone who is in fact at peace with a decision, but who has not yet had time to grieve everything the decision costs. She was not unhappy. She was clear-eyed about that. Unhappy was not the right word for what she was. She was emptied out, perhaps, cleaned of something that had been living in her for a long time and not yet sure what would fill the space. She watched the countryside and let herself carefully feel it. She thought about the dining room, about the card in the dowager's handwriting and the precise way she had walked to her place and sat down and unfolded her napkin without a tremor. She was not sorry she had done it that way. The alternative, the scene, the tears, the confrontation, would have given them something to talk about. This way, they had nothing. Only a folded napkin and an empty chair, which said everything she wanted said without a single word that could be used against her. She thought about the miniature. She had carried it in her dress pocket for the 2 days between Christmas and her departure, taking it out occasionally and looking at it with the detached curiosity of someone examining evidence. He had been 19 when he painted it. She had been 17. It was summer. She remembered the summer, a long and golden one before his father died and everything changed. He had asked her to sit still and she had tried and failed, and he had laughed at her and told her she was the worst subject he had ever attempted, and she had said he was the worst painter she had ever sat for, and they had both been lying, which was perhaps the beginning of everything, or the middle of it, or the part she should have paid more attention to. She had placed it on his desk because she could not keep it and she could not throw it away. Returning it was the only honest thing. A settling of accounts between 2 people who were no longer going to pretend they owed each other nothing. She had not cried when she left it there. She had cried, very briefly, on the coach out of Wiltshire, with her forehead pressed against the cold glass, and the wool merchant's wife dozing across from her, and the winter fields going past in the gray early morning. She had allowed herself exactly that much, the width of 1 county, the length of 1 hour, and then she had straightened up and opened her book and not cried again. Mrs. Agnes Farrow met her at the door of the house on Harriet Row herself, which Rosalind had not expected, and which told her something immediately useful about the woman's character. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably always been more interesting than beautiful, and had settled comfortably into that fact. Her late husband had been a merchant in the wool trade, successful enough that the house on Harriet Row was solid and well furnished without being ostentatious, the kind of house that spoke of money earned rather than inherited, which Rosalind found she preferred. She had spent 15 years in a house that was magnificent in the way of things that have always been magnificent and expect to go on being so indefinitely. There was something restful, she was discovering, about a house that had simply decided to be comfortable. The three daughters were presented at dinner on the first evening. Margaret, the eldest, was 14 and possessed of the particular intensity of a highly intelligent girl who has not yet found adequate outlet for it. She wanted to discuss everything: history, botany, the validity of phrenology, which she had been reading about and was inclined to dismiss, and the novels of Walter Scott, which she had strong and contradictory opinions about. Rosalind liked her immediately and without reservation. Clara, 11, was gentle and observant and said very little at the table, but watched Rosalind throughout the meal with the focused assessment of a child deciding whether a new person could be trusted. By the end of dinner, she had apparently reached a provisional conclusion in Rosalind's favor, because she passed her the salt without being asked and said, very quietly, that she hoped Rosalind liked cats, because there were 3 of them and they would need to be introduced properly, or there would be trouble. Bessie, 7, said that she had had a governess before who smelled of camphor and made her practice scales for 2 hours every day, and she hoped Rosalind would not do that. Rosalind said she detested camphor and could not play the pianoforte herself, which was a professional deficiency she was entirely willing to own, and Bessie looked at her with the relieved, uncomplicated approval of a child who has been spared something she dreaded. Rosalind went to bed that first night in a room that was small and somewhat drafty, and overlooked a narrow courtyard where a single lantern threw a circle of amber light on the cobblestones, and she lay on her back in the dark and took stock of herself. She was employed. She was solvent. She was in a house where she had already been treated with more straightforward human decency than she had experienced in 15 years of living under the roof of a duke. The work ahead was real work, lessons to plan, children to teach, a household to find her place within, and it was hers in a way that nothing at Ashford Hall had ever quite been hers. She thought that she might, given time, be content here. Not happy, not yet, not the deep, uncomplicated happiness she had perhaps once believed was possible, before she understood what it would have required and who would have had to choose it, but content, purposeful, herself, in a way she had been slowly, gradually, imperceptibly ceasing to be. She closed her eyes. She did not think about Ashford Hall. She was becoming, she found, surprisingly competent at not thinking about Ashford Hall. It was a skill one could develop. She was learning, like any other, through practice, through repetition, through the disciplined redirection of attention toward things that were real and present and genuinely hers. She thought about Margaret's argument against phrenology instead, and was asleep within the half hour. January passed, then most of February. The days fell into a shape she had not expected to find so quickly: early mornings with a cup of tea at the window before the household woke, the schoolroom from 9 to 1 with its particular pleasures and frustrations, afternoons that were her own to walk in or read in as she chose. Edinburgh in winter was austere and magnificent in equal measure, the gray stone of its buildings taking on a particular luminous quality in the low northern light, the castle brooding above everything like a second sky. She walked a great deal. She found a lending library whose proprietor had strong opinions about Voltaire and was willing to discuss them at length. She made the acquaintance of a Miss Janet Lowell, a minister's daughter who lived 2 streets over and taught drawing to the daughters of the same families Rosalind served, and who had the rare quality of being genuinely funny without trying to be. The Duke's first letter arrived in the 2nd week of January. She recognized the handwriting before she turned the letter over, and sat with it in her hand for a moment, feeling the slight added weight of it, heavier than a social note, lighter than a formal document, and the particular quality of having a thing in front of you that you have been half expecting and half hoping would not come. She read it once carefully all the way through. It was formal, concerned. It asked for confirmation of her safe arrival and her address, and expressed, in language so guarded it had clearly been revised several times, something that might generously be called regret, though it stopped well short of naming what it was regretting, or why, or what he imagined could be done about it. She folded it, placed it in the small cedar box where she kept her important papers, and did not reply. The second arrived at the end of January. She read that one twice. It said more, enough more that she sat with it longer and felt, against her will, the familiar pull of it, the particular frequency of his written voice, which she had always been helplessly attuned to. She recognized what he was trying to say beneath what he had actually written, and that was precisely why she could not answer it. Because answering it would have meant beginning again from a position that had not changed, and she had spent 15 years in that position, and she was not going back to it. Not for letters. Not for what letters were reaching toward. The third came in mid-February, and she read it standing at the window with the Edinburgh sleet tapping against the glass. 3 sentences. She stood there for quite a long time after. Then she placed it in the cedar box with the others and went down to the schoolroom, where Margaret was waiting with 17 questions about the Roman occupation of Britain and an argument already prepared. The letter from the solicitor arrived on a Wednesday in late February, on a morning when the sky over Edinburgh had cleared unexpectedly to a pale, wintry blue, and the cobblestones in the courtyard below were glittering with frost. It was not from Mr. Calloway, the dowager's man. It was from a Mr. Thomas Aldridge of Aldridge and Sons, Lincoln's Inn, London. The name meant nothing to her. She broke the seal with the mild curiosity one brings to unexpected correspondence, expecting perhaps some administrative matter connected to her departure from Ashford Hall, an accounting of some small personal sum, a formality of some kind. She read the first paragraph and sat down. She read it again. Her father, who had died when she was 11, who she remembered in fragments. His hands, his laugh, the particular smell of his study, the way he had called her his most sensible person, had left a provision in his will that had been held in trust by Aldridge and Sons for the past 15 years. The provision was simple in its structure and extraordinary in its implications. A parcel of land in the Scottish borders, 30 acres, a farmhouse, a modest annual income from its tenancy, held in trust for his daughter until the conditions of release were met. The conditions were written in her father's own words, set down before his death, preserved in the careful language of legal document, but unmistakably his voice beneath it. The trust shall be released to my daughter Rosalind upon the occasion of her departing the household of the Ashford family of her own free will and volition, uncoerced by dismissal, disgrace, or the action of any other party. Should she leave freely of her own choosing, the property and its income pass to her in full and without condition. Should she be removed by any other means, the trust reverts to a charitable institution of Mr. Aldridge's choosing. She will know when that day is. She always has. Rosalind sat at the small writing table in her room for a very long time. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt. She could hear Clara in the corridor below, talking to one of the cats in the patient, reasonable tone she used with animals and small children. The smell of breakfast came up from the kitchen. Edinburgh went about its Wednesday morning with perfect indifference to what was happening in the small room on the second floor of the house on Harriet Row. Her father had known. He had died when she was 11 years old, before he could protect her himself, and so he had done the next best thing. He had built her a way out and hidden it inside the law, where no one could touch it, and he had made it conditional on exactly the one thing that would prove she had not been broken by whatever came before it, that she had left freely, chosen freely on her own terms and no one else's. She had no one to advocate for her, the dowager had written. Her father, dead for 15 years, had been advocating for her all along. She pressed her fingers flat against the letter and breathed carefully, the way one breathes when something is moving through you that is too large for the ordinary size of a Wednesday morning. Grief and gratitude wound together so tightly, she could not have said where one ended and the other began. She thought of him, his hands, his laugh, the way he had looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with the particular expression of a parent who sees in their child something they hope the world will not diminish. It had not diminished her. She thought he would have been glad to know that. She sat there until she had her face in order again. Then she folded the letter with the same care she had folded her napkin on Christmas Eve, precisely, deliberately, as a woman who knows the value of what she is holding, and placed it not in the cedar box with the Duke's letters, but in the inside pocket of her dress, close to her, where she intended to keep it for some time. She went downstairs to the schoolroom. Margaret was already at her desk, spectacles on, a new argument about Roman aqueducts visibly forming behind her eyes. Clara had brought a cat. Bessie had drawn a horse on the cover of her arithmetic book and was looking at it with innocent satisfaction. Rosalind stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it, the cold morning light, the scratched wooden desks, the cat arranging itself on the window ledge with sovereign authority, the three girls who were already, in their different ways, beginning to feel like something that belonged to her. She had 30 acres in the Scottish borders and an income and a door her father had left open. She had, for the first time in her adult life, somewhere that was entirely and irrevocably hers. "Right," she said, stepping into the room. "Margaret, aqueducts, let's hear it." Lady Helena Fitzwilliam had requested the conversation on a Thursday. She arrived at Ashford Hall in the first week of March, with considerably less luggage than her January visit, and a manner that had shed, entirely, the polished social performance of that earlier occasion. She wore a plain traveling dress and no jewelry except her mother's ring, and she came alone, no companion, no lady's maid hovering at a discreet distance, which told the Duke, before she had said a single word, that whatever she had come to say was something she intended to say as herself, without the cushioning architecture of rank and propriety around it. He received her in the library, which was the room in the house that felt least like his mother's territory. She sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and a directness in her expression that he had come, over the preceding weeks, to genuinely respect. Whatever else Lady Helena was, she was not a dissembler. He thought, not for the first time, that under other circumstances, in a world where neither of them had been steered here by the careful hands of people who considered such arrangements simply good management, they might have been friends. "I want to release you from this engagement," she said, "and I want you to let me do it cleanly, without the kind of negotiation our families will attempt to impose on the process." He said nothing. He waited. "I have been corresponding," she continued, with the composed precision of someone who has rehearsed a difficult thing until it became manageable, "with a gentleman in Edinburgh, a Mr. Robert Cairns. We were acquainted some years ago before my family decided that a duke's name was a better prospect than the happiness of their daughter. I did not argue at the time. I should have. I did not." She met his eyes steadily as she said this. There was no drama in it, no bid for sympathy. Simply a fact, stated clearly, by a woman who had decided she was done with the indirection that had brought her to this library in the first place. "Mr. Cairns is a man of respectable means and impeccable character," she said. "He is not a duke. My mother will not recover from this for some considerable time. I have accepted that." A pause. "I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know the full situation, and because I believe you are in a position not entirely unlike my own, though you have been considerably less willing to name it." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "Edinburgh," he said. It was not a question. She understood it anyway. Mr. Cairns mentioned in his last letter that he had encountered a Miss Hartwell at a lecture on Scottish antiquities at the Royal Society. He described her as formidably intelligent and entirely unmoved by his first attempt at conversation, which he found encouraging. The faintest smile. He is persistent by nature. I asked him, quite deliberately, not to be persistent in this particular direction. I thought you should have the opportunity first. The Duke stood. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the park, the bare trees, the gray sky, the long drive that led away from the house and eventually, after enough roads and enough miles, to Edinburgh. She has not answered my letters, he said. No, Lady Helena agreed. I imagine she hasn't. She may not receive me. She may not, she said. That is rather the point, isn't it, whether you go anyway. The conversation with his mother took place that evening. He had considered, briefly, the possibility of managing it delicately, of finding a sequence of words that would convey his intentions while preserving enough of the existing architecture that his mother could retreat from it without too much visible damage. He had always been, by temperament, a man who preferred navigation to confrontation. He had learned it young in this house, from a woman who was so comprehensively certain of her own correctness that disagreement had always seemed less like a legitimate alternative and more like a failure of understanding on the part of whoever disagreed. He had sat with that thought for some time before going to find her. He found her in the drawing room, reading correspondence by the fire, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She looked up when he entered with the mildly alert expression she reserved for unexpected interruptions, not unwelcoming, simply assessing. Lady Helena is releasing the engagement, he said. His mother set down her letter very carefully. I see. She has her own reasons, which are hers to speak of or not as she chooses. I am not contesting it. Edward, I am going to Edinburgh. A silence fell over the room that had a different quality from his mother's usual silences, those measured, tactical pauses she deployed the way a chess player deploys a tempo, to force the other person to speak and thus reveal something. This silence was different. This one had something in it that he had not, in 34 years, heard in his mother's silences before. Something that might, in a less composed woman, have been called uncertainty. She left, his mother said finally. Of her own choosing, she made herself very clear. She made herself very clear, he agreed, because you made the situation very clear to her, in writing, before Christmas. I acted in your interest. You acted in the interest of the Ashford name, he said, which is not the same thing, and I think you know that, and I think we have both pretended for a very long time that it was. He kept his voice level. He was not angry precisely, or rather, he had been angry for several weeks, and had arrived on the other side of it at something quieter and more durable, something that felt uncomfortably like clarity. I am not reproaching you. You have always done what you believed was right for this family. I understand that. But I am 34 years old, and I have spent those years doing what was expected of me, and I sat at a table on Christmas Eve and watched a woman I have known since she was a girl be seated below the kitchen staff, and I said nothing, and I cannot. He stopped, steadied himself. I will not compound that with continued inaction. His mother looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a clock was ticking with its usual indifferent precision. She may not have you, she said at last. I know. She would be entirely within her rights. I know that too. Another silence. His mother looked down at the letter in her hand, then set it aside on the table beside her tea. When she looked up again, something in her expression had shifted, not softened, precisely, because softening was not a thing his mother did easily or quickly or perhaps at all, but something in it had reconsidered. The way a very long-held position reconsiders when it meets, at last, an argument it cannot dismiss. She is a good woman, his mother said, very quietly, the words appearing to cost her something she had not budgeted for. Yes, the Duke said, she is. He left her by the fire and went to tell his valet to pack a bag for Scotland. In Edinburgh on the same Thursday evening, Rosalind was sitting at the writing table in her room with the lamp lit, and a stack of exercise books open before her: Margaret's essay on the Roman conquest, Clara's arithmetic, Bessie's letters which were improving, and which Bessie would be pleased to hear tomorrow morning. A knock at her door. Mrs. Farrow put her head in. "A letter came for you this afternoon," she said. "I forgot to give it at dinner. Forgive me." She set it on the corner of the desk and withdrew with the tact of a woman who knew when to leave a room. Rosalind looked at the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a neat, somewhat angular hand she didn't recognize. The postmark was Edinburgh. She broke the seal with the paper knife and unfolded it. It was from a Mr. Robert Cairns. He introduced himself briefly: a merchant, a neighbor in the loose sense that Edinburgh used the term, a friend of the Farrow family. He had met her at the Royal Society lecture in February, he wrote, though he suspected she might not remember him. He had attempted conversation, and she had been politely conclusive on the subject of ending it, which he entirely understood and did not hold against her. He was writing, he said, because he felt she ought to know something, and because his conscience would not allow him to stay silent about it. He was engaged recently to a Lady Helena Fitzwilliam of Wiltshire, who had, in the course of their recent correspondence, mentioned Rosalind by name. Lady Helena had asked him, with considerable delicacy, to write to warn her that a certain party might be making the journey to Edinburgh in the coming days. Lady Helena wished it known, through this somewhat circuitous route, for which she apologized, that the engagement between herself and the Duke of Ashford was being dissolved, and that this dissolution was entirely of her own initiation, and that the Duke was coming to Edinburgh not at anyone's suggestion, but of his own choosing and his own will. He had thought, Mr. Cairns wrote in closing, that she deserved to hear this from a neutral party rather than to be taken by surprise. He hoped the information was welcome. He hoped further that she was well, and that Edinburgh was treating her kindly. He remained with respect, etc. Rosalind read the letter twice. Then she set it down and sat very still at her writing table, with Margaret's essay on Roman conquest open in front of her, and the lamp making its small circle of yellow light in the Edinburgh dark, and the sounds of the house settling around her. Mrs. Farrow's voice somewhere below, a cat moving in the corridor, the distant clatter of a carriage on the cobblestones outside. He was coming. Of his own will, not managed into it, not steered by anyone, coming because he had chosen to, which was the thing she had waited 15 years for him to do about anything that mattered and had stopped, finally, expecting. She thought about what she would say. She thought about what she would not say. She thought about the cedar box with its 3 unanswered letters, and the miniature she had returned to his desk, and the folded napkin, and all the years of sitting very still while things happened around her that she had no power to change. She thought about 30 acres in the Scottish borders and her father's handwriting, and the door he had left open. She was not the woman who had sat at that table in December. She understood that clearly and without drama. That woman had been waiting, still waiting for something to be given, waiting to be chosen, waiting with the patient endurance of someone who has confused endurance with virtue. She was not waiting any longer. She had walked through the door. She was standing on the other side of it, in a life that was genuinely and entirely hers. If he came to Edinburgh, he was coming to find that woman. Not the one he had left behind. She picked up her pen. She thought for a moment. Then, with the quiet and deliberate composure that had always been her greatest resource, she turned back to Margaret's essay on Roman conquest and wrote her comments in the margin in her neat, clear hand. She would sleep on it. She had learned these past months that most things looked different in the morning, clearer, truer, stripped of the drama that night had a way of lending them. She would sleep, and in the morning she would know what she thought, and whatever she decided, she would decide it freely. That was, after all, exactly what her father had arranged. He arrived on a Saturday. Edinburgh received him with the weather it reserved for southerners who came north in March without adequate preparation. A low, determined rain that was not quite cold enough to be dignified as sleet, but was certainly cold enough to be unpleasant, driven sideways off the firth by a wind that knew its business. The Duke stood outside the house on Harriet Row for a moment after his carriage had pulled away, his coat already damp at the shoulders, looking up at the building with the expression of a man who has rehearsed a thing many times and is now discovering that rehearsal and arrival are not the same experience at all. The house was solid and well kept, painted shutters, a brass knocker in the shape of a thistle, a lamp burning already in the downstairs window, though it was only mid-afternoon because the March sky over Edinburgh had decided that adequate light was someone else's responsibility. He knocked. A housemaid answered, young, efficient, mildly startled by the quality of his coat relative to the ordinariness of the door she had just opened. He gave his name and asked if Miss Hartwell was at home. The maid disappeared. He stood in the narrow entrance hall and waited, his hat in his hands, water dripping quietly from his brim onto the flagstone floor. He heard footsteps on the stairs above, then a pause. Then the footsteps resumed more slowly, and Rosalind appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at him. She was wearing a dark blue dress he had never seen before. Her hair was pinned simply, the way she had always worn it when she was working rather than performing. She was not wearing the expression he had been braced for, not cold, not wounded, not the careful blankness of someone marshalling their defenses. She was simply looking at him with the clear, level attention she had always brought to things that required it, as though he were a problem she was in the process of assessing. He had forgotten, somehow in the months of her absence, how completely she could look at a person, how there was nowhere to hide in it. "Your Grace," she said. The formality of it landed with quiet precision. "Miss Hartwell," he held her gaze, "I am sorry to arrive without warning." "You are not entirely without warning," she said, which told him that Mr. Cairns had written, which told him that Lady Helena had arranged it, which told him, as he already knew, but now felt with the full weight of it, that he had not deserved any of this consideration and had been given it anyway. She came down the remaining stairs. "Come through," she said, and led him into a small sitting room off the hall, a comfortable room, plainly furnished, with books stacked on every available surface and a fire burning and a gray cat occupying the best chair with absolute sovereign authority. Rosalind did not remove the cat. She simply took the other chair and left him the small sofa, which was upholstered in a faded green that had clearly once been fashionable and was now simply itself. He sat. The cat regarded him with the specific contempt that cats reserve for people who have recently done something to deserve it. He thought, absurdly, that he had never in his life felt the weight of a room's judgment more completely. "I won't ask you why you didn't answer my letters," he said. He had decided this on the road north. It was, he felt, the one thing he was sure of. "You had your reasons and they were sufficient, and I won't make you explain them." Rosalind said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and waited with the particular quality of waiting that had always been distinctively hers, not passive, not submissive, but alert. The waiting of someone who has learned that most people, given enough silence, will eventually say the thing they actually came to say. He had always known this about her. He was only now understanding how much he had relied on it over the years as a reason not to speak first himself. "I came to tell you 3 things," he said, "and then I will go or stay as you prefer, and I will accept whatever you decide without argument or appeal. That is not a negotiation. I mean it precisely as I've said it." She inclined her head very slightly, listening. "The first is that I found my mother's letter, after you left. I know what it said, and I know that you read it before Christmas, and I know that you sat at that table knowing what it said, and I need you to understand," he stopped. The sentence had several possible endings, and none of them were adequate. "There is no version of what happened that Christmas that reflects well on me. I could explain the circumstances. I could point to pressures and obligations and the particular architecture of a life that had been managed, for as long as I could remember, by people who were very certain of what it required. None of that is an excuse. I was 20 feet away from you. I saw what was done. I said nothing and I did nothing, and I have thought about that every day since you left, and I am not here to ask you to excuse it. I am here to tell you that I know it clearly, without qualification. The fire shifted. A coal settled with a soft sound. The cat, apparently satisfied with something, closed its eyes. The second thing, he said, is about the miniature. Her hands in her lap were very still. I painted that the summer I was 19, he said. You kept moving and I told you to sit still, and you told me I was a poor painter, and we were both lying, and I think we both knew it even then. I kept that miniature for 15 years. It sat in my desk drawer and I took it out occasionally, more often than I would ever have admitted to anyone, including myself, and I looked at it, and I put it back, and I went on with whatever was required of me. He paused. When I found it on my desk on Christmas night, I understood, for the first time, with the particular clarity that comes too late and costs too much, what I had been doing with it all those years, what I had been doing with a great many things, keeping them in drawers, taking them out in private, putting them back. He looked at her directly. I am 34 years old, and I have spent those years being very competent at the management of a large estate and very thoroughly useless at anything that mattered. Something moved across Rosalind's face, brief, involuntary, quickly composed. He couldn't name it with certainty. He went on before he lost his nerve. The third thing is the simplest and the one I should have said first 15 years ago, and did not, because I was a coward dressed up as a responsible man. He met her eyes. I love you. I have loved you for so long that I cannot identify the beginning of it, which I think means it was never not the case. I am not telling you this because I expect anything from it. I am telling you because you have spent your entire adult life in a house where people decided things about you without telling you the truth, and I will not do that. You deserve to know the truth of where I stand, even if what you do with that information is to ask me to leave Edinburgh and not return. The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain moved against the windows with its patient, indifferent sound. Somewhere above them, footsteps, one of the children, moving between rooms. The ordinary life of the house going on around this particular moment with complete unconcern. Rosalind looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze and did not try to read it, and did not try to fill the silence, which was perhaps the hardest thing he had done in the entire journey. You said you would stay or go as I preferred, she said at last. Yes. And that you would accept whatever I decided without argument. Yes. She rose from her chair. She crossed to the window and stood looking out at the rain on the cobblestones below, her back to him, her hands loosely at her sides. He waited. The cat opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again. I'm not the person who left Ashford Hall, she said. Her voice was quiet and even and completely serious. I want you to understand that before anything else. I'm not waiting to be brought back to something, or restored to something, or returned to a version of my life that has simply been corrected. That life is over. I have 30 acres in the Scottish borders and an income and 3 girls upstairs who need a governess and a city that I am, slowly, learning to love. That is mine. Whatever happens or does not happen, that remains mine. I know, he said, I would not ask you to give any of it up. She turned from the window, looked at him. You have not asked me anything, she said. No, he held her gaze. I don't think I've earned the right to ask, not yet. Something shifted in her expression then, something small and careful, like a door that has been locked a long time moving a fraction on its hinges. Not open, but no longer quite as firmly closed. I need time, she said. Not as a courtesy, not as a softening of a refusal. I genuinely need time because what you have said tonight is considerable, and I have spent 15 years learning not to trust considerable things said by people who subsequently go quiet, and I am not capable of simply setting that aside in one evening, however sincerely the evening has been conducted. I understand. I am not saying no. She said it with the precision of a woman who means exactly the words she uses and no others. I am saying not tonight. He nodded. He stood, his hat still in his hands, and he looked at her, this woman in her plain blue dress in her borrowed sitting room in her adopted city, with her cat and her schoolroom and her 30 acres and her father's letter in her pocket. And he felt something that was not hope exactly, and not relief exactly, but something adjacent to both. Something that had the quality of a thing that might, given time and care, and the absence of further stupidity on his part, become one or the other or both. I will find rooms, he said. I will be in Edinburgh tomorrow morning. I know a respectable hotel on George Street, she said, which was not an invitation and was not a dismissal, and was, he thought, precisely calibrated to be neither. Thank you. She walked him to the door herself. He stepped out into the rain, which had not improved in the slightest since his arrival. He turned back once because he could not help it. She was standing in the doorway with the lamplight behind her and the Edinburgh dark and rain in front of her, and she was looking at him with that clear, level, thoroughly undeceived attention that had always been the most unnerving and the most valuable thing about her, and she was almost imperceptibly not quite frowning, which was, he understood, as close to encouragement as he was going to get tonight. He put on his hat and walked out into the rain. Rosalind closed the door. She stood with her hand on the latch for a moment, listening to his footsteps recede on the cobblestones. Then she turned and leaned her back against the door, in the narrow lamplit hallway with its smell of coal smoke and beeswax, and the faint distant scent of whatever Mrs. Farrow had been cooking for dinner, and she pressed her palms flat against the wood behind her and breathed. The cat appeared from the sitting room, sat at her feet, and looked up at her with an expression that conveyed both inquiry and judgment in roughly equal measure. I know, she told it. She stood there for another moment. Then she pushed herself upright, smoothed her dress, and went upstairs to check on the children. Bessie had fallen asleep over her reading. Clara was still awake, sitting up in bed with a book and one of the other cats arranged across her feet. Margaret, whose light was burning under her door at an hour that technically exceeded what had been agreed upon, was audible through the wood, apparently arguing with herself about something in a low, concentrated murmur that Rosalind recognized as the sound of a genuinely engaged mind working a problem. She knocked softly. The murmuring stopped. It is past 10, Margaret. A pause. I was nearly finished. Finish in the morning. A longer pause, during which the sound of a book being reluctantly closed was audible through the door. Miss Hartwell. Yes. Are you all right? Rosalind stood in the corridor with her hand flat against the door, and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, she said, go to sleep. She went to her own room. She sat at her writing table for a while without lighting the lamp, looking out at the courtyard where the rain was still falling, and the single lantern was making its amber circle on the wet cobblestones below. She thought about what he had said. She thought about the 3 letters in the cedar box, which she now understood differently than she had when she had placed them there. She thought about the miniature, not the returning of it, but the painting of it that summer, when they had both been young, and the future had seemed like something that would simply arrive and arrange itself sensibly, the way futures do when you are 19 and have not yet learned what they actually cost. She opened the cedar box. She took out the 3 letters and read them in order by the light that came through the window from the courtyard lantern below, just enough light to read by, no more. The first she had read before. The second she had read twice. The third she read now with different eyes than she had brought to it in February, and what she found in it, in those 3 careful, stripped-back sentences, was not the same thing she had found before. She had read them, all those weeks ago, as the words of a man trying to recover something he had lost through carelessness. She read them now as the words of a man who was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular ungainliness of someone learning a thing they should have learned long ago, to understand what he had been careless with. It was not the same thing. She folded the letters back into the box. She closed the lid. She sat for a while longer in the dark and the rain, and then she made herself a cup of tea with the small spirit lamp she kept on the windowsill for exactly these occasions, and she drank it slowly, and she thought, with the deliberate, patient honesty she brought to things that mattered, about what she wanted. Not what was reasonable, not what was safe. Not what the woman she had been at Ashford Hall would have wanted, from behind the glass of 15 years of waiting. What she, Rosalind, who owned 30 acres and had earned her own wage, and had walked out of that dining room with her napkin folded and her spine straight, what she wanted. She sat with the answer for a long time before she allowed herself to name it. Then she set down her cup and went to bed and slept for the first time in months, without dreaming of Ashford Hall at all. The estate was called Hartwell Grange, which was what the tenants had always called it, and which she saw no reason to change. It sat on a low rise above a river in the Scottish borders, surrounded by 30 acres of rough pasture and a kitchen garden that had been somewhat neglected under the previous arrangement, but which had, over the spring and summer, responded with considerable enthusiasm to being properly attended to. The farmhouse itself was old, older than Ashford Hall by at least a century, built in the solid, undecorated way of buildings that have decided to outlast everything and are simply getting on with it. The ceilings were low. The windows were deep set. The floors were flagstone throughout and cold in the mornings unless you remembered to put on shoes, which Rosalind frequently did not, being a person who had always thought better without them. She had taken possession in June, once the school term in Edinburgh was finished and Mrs. Farrow had found, through some minor miracle of the neighborhood network, a replacement governess who met with Margaret's exacting standards. The farewell had been prolonged and sincere. Clara had cried, which she had clearly found embarrassing and done anyway with great dignity. Bessie had given Rosalind a drawing of a horse, which she had folded carefully and put in her dress pocket alongside her father's letter, where it had stayed until she arrived at Hartwell Grange and found a proper frame for it. Margaret had shaken her hand very formally at the door of the house on Harriet Row and told her that she had been the best teacher she'd had, and then, before Rosalind could answer, had gone very quickly back inside. Rosalind had stood on the step for a moment after the door closed, smiling at nothing in particular, which was something she was finding herself doing rather more often these days. He had stayed in Edinburgh for 2 weeks in March. He had not pushed. He had not managed. He had appeared each morning at a reasonable hour and asked, with a diffidence that she found both genuine and slightly unfamiliar on him, whether she had time for a walk or a conversation, or simply the company of someone who was trying very hard to be different from what he had been, with varying degrees of success. She had said yes, most mornings, not all. She had reserved the right to say not today without explanation, and he had accepted it without question, which told her something. The accumulation of small things she was discovering told you more than the large ones. The large things could be performed. The small ones were harder to sustain falsely over time. They had walked through Edinburgh in the March rain and talked about everything except the thing they were really talking about, which was, she supposed, what courtship had always been, stripped of its formalities. He had been funny, which surprised her. Not in the polished drawing-room way, but in the quieter, more private way of a person who had spent a long time being serious in public and had, somewhere in the preceding months, decided to stop treating that as a requirement. He had told her, on the last morning before he returned to Wiltshire, that he would come back whenever she allowed it and stay away as long as she required, and that he had no intention of making this easy for himself by making it uncomfortable for her, and that he understood the difference between the two things now, which was an understanding he had arrived at somewhat late but intended to keep. She had looked at him for a moment on the steps of the hotel on George Street, in the thin March sunshine that had arrived on his last day, as if the weather had decided finally to make an effort, and she had said, carefully, that she thought he might come back in May. He had come back in May, and July, and September when the borders were turning gold and the estate was settling into autumn, and she was discovering something particular about watching the Scottish light move across the hills in the late afternoon that made her feel, with a quiet and uncomplicated certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He had stood beside her at the window on one of those September afternoons and said nothing for a long time, which was something he had become considerably better at, the companionable silence, the willingness to simply be present without requiring the moment to become something else. And then he had said, very quietly, that he thought he understood now what she had meant about the 30 acres. "Do you?" she said. "It is not the land," he said. "It is that no one gave it to you." She had looked at him then, sideways, in the way she had begun to let herself look at him, without the careful management of expression she had maintained for so many years, without the glass between herself and what she actually felt. "My father gave it to me," she said. "He left you the door," the Duke said. "You walked through it yourself." She had not answered him that afternoon. She had let the silence sit between them in the golden September light, and he had let her, and neither of them had felt the need to resolve it into something more definitive than it was. 3 weeks after that visit, she had written him a letter. It was not long. He had read it, she imagined, the way she had read his more than once in different lights, looking for the thing beneath the thing. She hoped he had found it. She was fairly certain, knowing him as she now did and as she had always done, that he had. Christmas at Hartwell Grange was nothing like Christmas at Ashford Hall. There were no 40-seat dining rooms, no garlands of imported holly, no assembled ranks of county society performing seasonal goodwill at one another across 3 feet of polished mahogany. There was a table that seated 12 at a push, which tonight seated 9, Mrs. Farrow and her daughters, who had made the journey from Edinburgh with considerable excitement and considerable luggage, Mr. Cairns and Lady Helena, who had married quietly in October and were spending their first Christmas in Scotland, and the Duke, who had arrived the previous evening with his valet and a quantity of wine that she had told him was excessive and which was turning out to be precisely right. The Dowager had not been invited. This had been discussed once with the seriousness it deserved and set aside. Perhaps next year, perhaps the year after. There was time, and the situation was what it was, and Rosalind had found, over the course of a year in which she had become very clear about what she was and was not willing to carry, that she could hold space for the possibility of repair without requiring it to happen before she was ready. Her father's letter had taught her that, among other things. Some provisions took time to mature. She had received in November a brief note from the Dowager. It had not said very much. It had said enough. She had read it and sat with it and placed it, not in the cedar box, which she was retiring from use, but in the small desk drawer where she kept things that were not yet resolved but were no longer urgent. That seemed, she thought, like the right place for it. Dinner was loud in the way of tables where the people around them actually like each other. Margaret was in the middle of an argument with Mr. Cairns about the economic conditions that produced the Highland clearances, which Mr. Cairns appeared to be enjoying enormously. Clara was teaching Bessie a card game of questionable rules that she claimed to have invented herself. Lady Helena and Mrs. Farrow had discovered a shared and passionate opinion about a novel they had both read and were pursuing it with the focused energy of people who have found an unexpected ally. The candles threw warm light across all of it, the mismatched chairs, the good wine in the plain glasses, the remains of a goose that had been excellent and a pudding that had been, as Bessie announced to the table, the best thing she had ever eaten in her entire life, which Rosalind had made herself and was inclined to agree with. She sat at the head of her own table. That was still a thing she felt every time, the particular unflashy solidity of it, not as triumph, not as vindication, simply as fact, the way the most important things become fact when they have settled into the ordinary shape of daily life. This was her table in her house on her land. She had put the flowers in the middle herself, late holly from the kitchen garden, unpretentious and dark-berried. She had chosen every person sitting around it. She had cooked a portion of what they were eating with her own hands, which would have horrified the dowager, and which she had decided was a quality she was entirely content to cultivate. The Duke was at her right. He had been talking to Mrs. Farrow for the past quarter of an hour about the tenancy arrangements of the Grange. He had offered in September to have his own land agent review the terms as a favor, not as a correction, and she had thought about it for 2 weeks and then accepted. And he was listening to her with the full, unhurried attention she had watched him develop over the course of this year, the attention of a man who has decided that listening is not a courtesy, but a skill worth acquiring. He caught her looking at him. He raised his glass very slightly, not a toast to the room, just to her. A small, private thing, the kind that exists only between two people and belongs to no one else. She raised hers in return. After dinner, when the candles had burned lower and the table had been cleared and Bessie had fallen asleep on the sofa with the cat. There was always a cat. She was discovering. This was apparently a permanent condition of her life now, and she found she didn't mind. And the conversation had settled into the quiet, unhurried warmth of a table that has no reason to perform any longer. The Duke leaned toward her and said, very softly, so that only she could hear, "No one seated below the kitchen staff this year." She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she had been learning over the course of this year, the one that was not the face he presented to drawing rooms and solicitors and county society and his mother. The one beneath all of that. The one that was, she had come to believe, actually his. She thought about the Christmas a year ago, the card in the dowager's handwriting, the walk to her place and the unfolding of her napkin, and the first spoonful of soup taken in the absolute stillness of a decision already made. She thought about the Edinburgh coach in the cold gray morning, and the room on Harriet Row, and the cedar box, and the letter from a dead man who had known her well enough to build her a door and trust her to find it. She thought about a summer when she was 17, and he was 19, and neither of them had known what it was they were beginning, and whether that beginning had survived everything that came after it, bent and altered and delayed by 15 years of things left in drawers and things not said. Whether it had survived all of that and arrived here, at this table in this house, on this particular Christmas night, intact. She thought it had. She thought it was, if anything, the stronger for it. The way things are stronger for having been tested. The way a door, once it has been opened freely, does not close in the same way again. "No," she said, "no one." And she laughed, not the careful, managed laugh she had deployed for years in rooms where laughing required permission, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere unguarded and uncalculated and entirely her own. It filled the low-ceilinged room completely. Outside, over the Scottish borders, the first snow of the year had begun to fall quietly, without fuss, the way the best things arrive. It settled on the rough pasture and the kitchen garden and the dark river below the rise, and on the roof of Hartwell Grange, which was old enough to have seen a great many winters and had decided long ago that it intended to see a great many more. Inside, the candles burned. She had no one to advocate for her, the letter had said. She had walked through a door her father left open. She had built the rest herself. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.